There are people who don't enter your life to walk beside you. They enter to lean on you, and never leave. At first, they seem to just need a little attention, a little care, a little understanding. You tell yourself, everyone goes through hard phases. And out of empathy, you offer the best you have: time, listening, patience, emotional presence. What you don't realize is that, for this type of person, none of this is temporary. They don't want support, they want supply. This is the type of person who consumes everything you have because they don't know how to exist without draining something from others. They don't sustain themselves emotionally. They can't self-regulate. They don't take responsibility for their own emptiness. So they turn relationships into sources of energy. And you become that source. It doesn't happen suddenly. There's no clear moment where you say, now I'm being used. It happens slowly, silently, almost invisibly. First, you start giving up small things. Then you give up rest. Then you give up boundaries. Then you give up your own sense of reality. You begin adapting all the time to avoid upsetting them, to prevent conflict, to avoid abandoning someone who seems to need you so much. And before you realize it, you're living to keep the other person emotionally stable, even if it costs you your own stability. This type of person doesn't need to be cruel, aggressive, or openly abusive. Often, they present themselves as fragile, sensitive, wounded by the past. And that's what makes it confusing, because leaving feels almost like an act of violence. But there is a huge difference between supporting someone and becoming someone's emotional life support. When you love, you share. When you are consumed, you are depleted. The greatest danger is that this depletion doesn't come with clarity. It comes with guilt. You feel tired, but you wonder if you're being selfish. You feel empty, but you think you should try harder. You feel drained, but you convince yourself that love requires sacrifice. This video exists to help you see what you may have felt for a long time, but couldn't name. Because some people don't want to grow with you. They want to survive through you. And understanding this may be the first step toward reclaiming everything that was taken. The type of person who consumes everything you have rarely appears dangerous at the beginning. On the contrary, they usually enter your life in a subtle, almost innocent way. Sometimes as someone who needs help, other times as someone who finally feels safe with you. In the beginning, there is intensity. They open up quickly. They share deep stories. They talk about old pain, trauma, disappointment, abandonment. You feel a special connection. A sense of closeness that seems rare. And in a way, that's exactly what pulls you in. Because when someone shows vulnerability so early, you interpret it as trust, not as dependence. This person may say things like, "I've never been able to talk about this with anyone. You understand me like no one ever has. With you, I can finally be myself." These phrases aren't necessarily lies. But they function like invisible threads, emotionally binding you before any real balance exists. You start to feel important. Needed. Different from everyone else. And that's when the roles slowly begin to shift. Little by little, you stop being someone who simply shares life and become someone who stabilizes the other person emotionally. If they're okay, you feel relief. If they're not, you feel tension. If they pull away, you feel guilt. If they come closer, you feel responsibility. This stage is often marked by extreme empathy on your part. You ignore red flags because you don't want to seem cold, distant, or insensitive. You think, this person has already suffered too much. So you adapt. They may not ask directly. Often, they don't need to. Their suffering takes up so much space that you automatically begin adjusting your routine, your mood, and your decisions to accommodate it. Without realizing it, you start moving around them. This type of person often creates a subtle narrative of constant fragility. There's always something wrong. A new problem. A recurring emotional crisis. A difficulty that never truly resolves. And you stay there, present and available, believing that eventually things will balance out. But they don't. Because what looks like a phase is actually a pattern. What looks like need is dependence. What looks like connection is emotional absorption. The most dangerous part of this initial phase is that it creates an image that will later be used against you, the image of you as the one who handles it, who understands, who never abandons. And when you try to set boundaries later, you're not just saying no. You're breaking a role that was silently assigned to you from the very beginning. And that's why leaving feels so difficult. What makes this type of person so hard to identify is not what they do, but how they do it. Emotional consumption rarely happens through explicit demands or obvious behaviors. It happens through an invisible mechanism built on guilt, obligation, and fear of loss. This mechanism begins when you start feeling responsible for the other person's emotional state. Not because someone clearly said so, but because everything around you suggests that if you're not there, something will collapse. If you take too long to respond, they become sad. If you set boundaries, they feel rejected. If you prioritize yourself, they feel abandoned. Little by little, you learn that being available prevents pain. Not yours, theirs. So you adapt. Not because you want to, but because you feel you must. This type of person lives in a constant state of emotional need. But instead of seeking autonomy, they externalize that need. They transfer to you the role of regulating their emotions, validating their existence, and giving meaning to their life. And that drains you. It drains because there is no pause. No rest. No real reciprocity. You become the emotional stabilizer for someone who never stabilizes themselves. And any attempt on your part to step back, even a healthy one, is interpreted as a threat. The most dangerous part of this mechanism is that it doesn't require conscious manipulation. Many of these people don't wake up thinking, I'm going to drain everything this person has. This is simply how they function. Often, they learned early in life that emotional survival depends on someone else. So they create bonds where the other person feels indispensable and guilty for wanting to leave. You begin anticipating needs, predicting crises, adjusting your words, your time, your decisions. Not because you want to please, but because you want to avoid the emotional weight that comes afterward. This is when the relationship stops being a space of exchange and becomes a space of emotional surveillance. You're always alert. Always regulating. Always managing feelings that aren't yours. Meanwhile, your own emotions slowly move to the background. You get tired, but you don't rest. You suffer, but you don't express it. You need support, but you don't ask. Because deep down, it feels like there's no room for two people. Emotional consumption happens when a relationship demands that you be whole, while the other person never takes responsibility for themselves. And the name for that is not deep love. It's dependency disguised as connection. One of the most confusing aspects of being involved with someone who consumes everything you have is that the signs of the problem almost never appear in them. They appear in you. In your body. In your mind. In the way you move through life. You can't clearly point out what's wrong, but you feel that something isn't right. A tiredness that doesn't go away, even after rest. A constant irritability with no clear cause. A heavy feeling when you wake up, as if the day already demands too much from you. You start becoming emotionally unavailable to other areas of your life. Things that once brought you joy lose their brightness. Important people drift away. Your interests, your projects, your dreams, all begin to feel secondary. And yet, you keep going. The body speaks when the mind tries to justify too much. Anxiety. Insomnia. Muscle tension. Low energy. Difficulty concentrating. But you don't connect this to the relationship. You connect it to work, stress, life in general. Because admitting that the relationship is making you sick feels too heavy. It feels selfish. It feels exaggerated. Gradually, you stop observing yourself. Your emotions begin revolving around the other person. If they're okay, you feel relief. If they're not, you feel guilt. Your inner state stops being a priority. You also begin silencing yourself. Avoiding topics. Measuring your words. Not because you want to hide who you are, but because you've learned that any self-expression might trigger an emotional reaction you'll have to manage later. That is a deep sign of exhaustion, when being yourself feels like work. You notice that you're always explaining, always justifying, always trying to prove that you're not abandoning, rejecting, or hurting anyone. And this consumes mental energy constantly. Another crucial sign is the gradual loss of clarity. You start doubting your own perceptions. What bothers you starts to feel small. What hurts you gets minimized. You begin thinking, maybe I'm overreacting. This type of relationship doesn't destroy you all at once. It wears you down slowly. It empties you while maintaining an appearance of normalcy. And the most dangerous part, the more depleted you become, the more dependent the other person grows on whatever you still manage to give. Until there comes a point where you feel you have nothing left. And yet still feel like you can't stop. One of the hardest, and most painful, questions that arise in this type of relationship is, if this hurts me so much, why do I stay? The answer is almost never weakness. It's emotional conditioning. You don't stay because you don't notice the exhaustion. You stay because, over time, you were trained to believe that leaving would cause even more pain, not in you, but in the other person. And that idea weighs more than your own fatigue. You learned, silently, that your value in the relationship is tied to your ability to sustain, support, understand, and endure. The more you tolerate, the more you feel like you're doing the right thing. There is also hope. Hope that all of this is just a phase. That if you remain patient, present, and understanding, something will change. That the person will grow. That the relationship will balance itself. But this hope is often fueled by small moments of relief. Brief periods when things feel lighter. When the other person shows gratitude, affection, or emotional closeness. These moments act as emotional reinforcement. They make you believe all the effort is worth it. Another powerful factor is guilt. You feel guilty for thinking about leaving. Guilty for feeling tired. Guilty for wanting silence, distance, space. You begin treating your own needs as excessive. And there is fear. Fear of abandoning someone fragile. Fear of being seen as cold, insensitive, or selfish. Fear of repeating abandonment stories the other person carries, even though that responsibility isn't yours. Over time, you stop asking whether you are happy. The question becomes, will the other person be okay if I leave? And that changes everything. You may also feel that leaving would waste everything you've already invested, time, energy, care, patience. This creates a psychological trap. The more you invest, the harder it feels to walk away. But staying is not proof of love when you are losing yourself in the process. There is a profound difference between commitment and self-abandonment. Between empathy and self-erasure. Between caring and burning out. You continue because you were gradually convinced that your limits hurt, and your silence protects. And that is the moment when the bond stops being a choice and becomes an emotional prison. In relationships where one person consumes everything the other has, guilt doesn't appear as something aggressive or obvious. It shows up subtly, almost politely. Sometimes it doesn't even come through words, it comes through silence, looks, mood shifts, strategic withdrawal. You are not directly accused. You are made to feel. When you try to pull away a little, the other person becomes sad. When you express a boundary, they seem hurt. When you prioritize yourself, they shut down. And even if they say, "It's fine," the atmosphere changes. And you notice. This is the core of the trap. You begin associating your well-being with the other person's suffering. If you're okay, someone else is not. If you choose yourself, someone gets hurt. And this creates a constant internal conflict. You start feeling responsible not only for what you do, but for how the other person feels. This emotional responsibility was never agreed upon. It was built slowly. Every time you over-explained yourself. Every time you apologized for needing space. Every time you went back on your decision to avoid an emotional crisis. Over time, you learn that saying no carries an emotional cost that feels too high. So you avoid it. You give in before being asked. You adapt before conflict even arises. Guilt becomes an internal control system. Not because someone forces you, but because you don't want to carry the weight of seeing the other person suffer, even when that suffering comes from their inability to deal with frustration. You may also hear phrases that reinforce this trap, even indirectly. "You're the only person who understands me. Without you, I don't know what I'd do. When you pull away, I fall apart." These statements sound like love or vulnerability, but they place an enormous burden on you. They turn you into an emotional pillar, not a partner. And when you get tired, you don't feel entitled to stop. You feel indebted. This type of bond creates a dangerous inversion. The other person's suffering gains moral priority over your own. You begin believing that enduring is a virtue, that self-sacrifice proves character, that self-erasure is emotional maturity. But it isn't. Constant guilt is not love. Excessive emotional responsibility is not a healthy bond. And staying out of fear of hurting someone is not a free choice. When a relationship demands that you carry emotions that aren't yours, it stops being a space of connection and becomes a space of survival. The price of staying in a bond where you are constantly consumed is rarely paid all at once. It's charged in small, almost unnoticeable installments, but continuously. And that's exactly why many people only realize the magnitude of the loss when they are already deeply depleted. You start by giving up small things, a hobby, time alone, a conversation with someone important. Then you begin giving up opinions, desires, plans. Until there comes a point where you no longer know what you truly want, you only know what you need to do to keep the other person emotionally stable. Your identity begins to adapt to the relationship. You define yourself more by the role you play than by who you actually are. You become the support, the safe place, the foundation. And in doing so, you stop being the protagonist of your own life. There is also a deep impact on your self-esteem. Not because someone openly degrades you, but because you learn to see yourself only in relation to the other person. Your worth becomes measured by your emotional usefulness. If you help, you matter. If you get tired, you fail. This type of relationship also affects your ability to feel genuine joy. Because any moment of lightness comes with alertness. You never fully relax. There is always a sense that something might happen, that the other person might need you, that a crisis could emerge. You live in a state of emotional readiness. Over time, this turns into chronic exhaustion. You may be physically present, but emotionally distant. Not because of lack of love, but because of lack of internal resources. You gave so much that there's no space left to feel. Another silent cost is isolation. People around you may slowly drift away because you never have time, energy, or emotional availability. And gradually, the consuming bond becomes the center of your life. This creates a disguised mutual dependency. The other person depends on you to regulate themselves, and you begin depending on the role to feel needed. But the highest cost of all is the loss of yourself. You begin existing in function mode. The function of supporting. The function of caring. The function of holding everything together. And when you ask yourself who you are beyond that, silence answers. Staying in this type of bond doesn't destroy you with explosions. It erases you through consistency. There comes a moment in this type of bond when something quietly changes inside you. It's not a big event. It's not a final argument. It's a subtle, uncomfortable realization. You no longer recognize yourself the way you used to. You notice that you speak less. That you explain yourself less. That you avoid accessing parts of yourself that once felt natural. Not because someone asked you to, but because you learned that being fully present requires too much energy, and that energy is already being consumed elsewhere. You begin living on autopilot. You fulfill roles, reply to messages, show up physically. But emotionally, something withdraws. It's as if a part of you realized that showing up too much hurts. This disappearance isn't a conscious decision to give up. It's delayed self-protection. You stop sharing dreams because there's no space. You stop expressing discomfort because you know the emotional cost. You stop asking for support because you've grown used to being the one who sustains. Little by little, you become functional, but not alive. Another clear sign of this disappearance is the loss of spontaneity. You start overthinking before acting. You measure reactions. You calculate emotional consequences. Every choice goes through the filter of, will this create a problem later? Living like this is exhausting. You may also notice a growing disconnection from your own body. Constant tension. Shallow breathing. Difficulty relaxing. Your body stays in a state of alert because it learned it's never truly safe to let its guard down. And paradoxically, as you disappear, the other person takes up more and more space. Their needs intensify. Their emotions become more frequent. Their crises more recurrent. The more you fade, the more the relationship revolves around them. This is one of the most painful realizations, understanding that your internal absence doesn't create balance, it creates deeper dependency. You may start asking yourself, where did I lose myself? But that question is followed by another, is it still possible to come back? Emotional disappearance is a clear sign that the bond has stopped being nourishing. When a relationship requires you to shrink so the other person can exist, something is deeply misaligned. You don't disappear because you're weak. You disappear because you stayed too long in a space where there was no space for you. There comes a point in this process where no psychological explanation, no emotional effort, and no attempt at adjustment brings relief. It's the moment when you begin to see an uncomfortable truth. Some people don't want to become stronger, they want to be sustained. Accepting this hurts because it dismantles the narrative that kept you there for so long. The belief that with enough love, enough patience, and enough giving, the relationship would transform. That your effort would be rewarded with balance, maturity, and reciprocity. But the truth is that not all suffering leads to growth. And not all shared pain creates healthy connection. Some people grow accustomed to living off someone else's energy. They don't take responsibility because there has always been someone who compensated, held space, explained, endured. And as long as this system works, there is no real motivation for change. This truth also requires you to look at yourself honestly. Not to blame yourself, but to understand yourself. Because on some level, you accepted this role too. Maybe out of excessive empathy. Maybe out of fear of abandonment. Maybe because you learned, earlier in life, that love means sacrifice. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But continuing to ignore this truth keeps you trapped. Another difficult realization is that you cannot save someone at the cost of yourself. There is no love that compensates for constant self-erasure. There is no healthy bond where one person grows while the other is depleted. And as painful as it is to admit, sometimes the person doesn't change because they don't need to. They have you. Accepting this truth doesn't mean dehumanizing the other person. It doesn't mean denying their pain. It simply means recognizing that their suffering cannot be treated with your self-destruction. You may feel grief when you realize this. Grief for what could have been. Grief for the image of connection you held on to. Grief for the time, energy, and care you invested. But that grief is part of awakening. Because while you try to save someone who won't take responsibility, you delay rescuing yourself. The difficult truth is not that you failed. It's that you stayed too long trying to be everything for someone who wasn't willing to be responsible even for themselves. Recovering what was consumed doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with awareness. After spending so long in a bond where you had to shrink, adapt, and sustain, the first step isn't to run away or make impulsive decisions. It's to pause and honestly acknowledge, this cost me deeply. You lost energy. You lost clarity. You lost parts of yourself. And that deserves recognition without guilt. Recovery begins when you understand that boundaries are not punishment. They are protection. Setting boundaries isn't rejecting the other person, it's interrupting a pattern that drains you. It's saying, for the first time, that your existence also matters. At first, this may bring fear. Fear of reactions. Fear of guilt. Fear of seeming selfish. Because you were conditioned to believe that taking care of yourself hurts others. But that fear is a residue of the bond, not a sign that you're wrong. Another fundamental step is returning responsibility. Emotions that aren't yours need to go back to the person who feels them. This isn't coldness. It's emotional maturity. Each person must deal with their own emptiness to truly relate. You also need to relearn how to listen to yourself. To notice your body. To respect exhaustion. To validate discomfort without over-explaining. Coming back to yourself is a slow process, but a possible one. And perhaps the hardest part, accepting that not every bond survives when you stop self-erasing. Some relationships only exist as long as you sacrifice yourself. When that stops, they collapse. And that hurts. But it also frees you. Recovering what was consumed doesn't mean becoming hardened or closed. It means becoming whole again. Able to choose relationships where there is exchange, presence, and shared responsibility. You don't need to disappear to love. You don't need to burn out to be needed. And you don't need to carry someone to prove that what you feel is real. If this video helped you recognize this pattern, know this, it's not too late to come back to yourself. What was consumed can be rebuilt. With time. With awareness. With boundaries. And above all, with the courage to choose not to lose yourself again.